What is a higher mode? Why higher? What's higher than another? Are you saying it in terms of animals? It's a view, it's an old-fashioned Huxleyan view of evolution that most modern, Richard Dawkins, for example, most modern evolutionary scientists and so on, the ethologists would deprecate to say that there is a higher level of being, a higher mode of consciousness. Is it just like saying, well, you're better educated, you've read more, you know more? Is it you've somehow been enlightened, a Verklärungs effect, as the Germans would say, which is not necessarily intellectual, but is somehow spiritual? And if so, show me an example of it. Show me someone who has a higher mode of existence than I do. I
can answer that, I think, to some degree.
Yeah,
three ways. One, that higher mode of existence is what your conscience tortures you for not attaining.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
I think what my conscience tortures me for not attaining is that I was rude to someone yesterday and I shouldn't have been.
Right, but it's the shouldn't part of it.
Yes, the obligation. It's the
exactly.
David Hume, the problem of ought. Yeah.
Well, and then you think about how it manifests itself. You don't. This is why Nietzsche was wrong. You cannot create your own values.
Right.
The values impose themselves on you independent of your will. Now, maybe well, that's what your conscience does, and good luck trying to control it.
This is very anti-Nietzsche, isn't it?
Well, I'm a great admirer.
I know you are. That's why I made the point. It's very opposite to his philosophy.
But so Jung embarked on a lengthy critique of Nietzsche, and it's part of his work that isn't well known, I would say. We'll leave that be, except to say that the psychoanalysts, starting with Freud, well, not really, but popularized by Freud and systematized, showed that we weren't masters in our own psychological house.
Right.
There were autonomous entities,
yes,
and those would be the Greek gods to some degree that operated within us, and we were.
Which is Julian Jaynes's point, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
We're in. Yes. I have my problems with Jaynes, but as a overarching idea, there's interest in it. Okay, so there are things happening with us and to us in the moral domain that we cannot control.
Yeah.
And that stunned me when I first learned it as a proposition. It's, oh yes, look at that. Here's one. What are you interested in?
Yeah.
Well, that grips you. Okay. Number two, what does your conscience bother you about? Okay. Yeah. You're inadequate by your own standards. Mm-hmm. Now, what adequate would mean, that's a different question, but it's defined negatively by conscience.
Yes.
And then better, there's one that I said I would lay out three. You can look at Jean Piaget's work on developmental psychology.
On the development of the subject, yes.
He was a genetic epistemologist.
Yes,
what he wanted to do was, this is what he wanted to do. He wanted to unite science and religion. That was his goal. And he wanted to look at the empirical development of values. And what he concluded, at least in part, was that a moral stance that's better than a previous moral stance does all the things that the previous moral stance does, plus something else.
Yes. Yes.
And you can say the same thing as a scientific theory.
I remember I had a great, I loved Piaget, and his observation was so empirical, of course.
Yes, absolutely.
Of the development of the child and not quite the theory of mind, that wasn't his thing, but similar developments and signposts where people become aware of self.
Okay, so now Piaget looked specifically at the development of morality, and he was one of the first people to emphasize the importance of games.
Yeah.
And what he showed was that at 2 years old, let's say, a child can only play a game with him or herself.
Yeah.
But at 3, both children can identify an aim and then share it in a fictional world. So that's partly pretend play and the beginnings of drama, and then cooperate and compete within that domain.
Yeah.
And then what happens, and the game theorists have shown this, is that out of games, morality emerges.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example, and this is a crucial example. So if you pair juvenile rats together, the males, they have to play. They have to rough and tumble play because their prefrontal cortexes don't develop properly if they don't. Anyways, they have to play. You pair a big rat and a little rat, teenage rats together, and the big rat will stomp the little rat.
Yeah.
First encounter. So then you say power determines hierarchy.
Yeah.
Okay, but then you pair the rats multiple times, like 50.
Yeah.
Then if the big rat doesn't let the little rat win 30% of the time, the little rat will stop inviting him to play. And so you get an emergent reciprocity, even at the level of the rat.
Yeah. That is,
and it's
fascinating, isn't it? It's not dissimilar to the theory of mind games that were devised by Simon Baron-Cohen and others in the question of showing how neurodivergence develops in the autistic spectrum, for example. But one of the things that so interests me at the moment, because of the pandemic, which is slightly close to this, that you might be able to help me with, is I've been very interested in, as I have been over the years, at how completely out of favour B.F. Skinner and the behaviouralists have become since, I guess, since a man you probably don't admire that much, since Noam Chomsky rather demolished B.F. Skinner famously. And
on the language front.
On the language front. But also the whole nature of behavioralism and looking at rats and their behavior has... But
because it's hard.
When it came to this pandemic, one of the things that was hidden from the public was that every country had its scientific committees, which were mainly composed, of course, of virologists and epidemiologists and immunologists, but always behaviorologists too, because the secret to getting out of the pandemic wasn't just following science and tracking a microbe, an invisible virus in the air. It was how people would take it. And Sherlock Holmes, in the second Sherlock Holmes book, which is called The Sign of Four, says to Watson, I remember this, it's very interesting. He says, "You know, Watson, the statistician has shown that we can predict to an extraordinary order of accuracy the behavior of the average man." He uses the word man, whereas now we would have to say human or man and woman, but you know what I mean. The average man. We can absolutely predict how they will behave, but no one has yet and probably never will be able to predict how an individual will behave. So we can be talked about as a mass, and advertisers and politicians and psephologists and all kinds of other people are very good at knowing how we behave as a group. But as individuals, we are unknowable without face-to-face conversation and the history and so on. So that was one. And the other one, which I think is connected, was, I believe it was a B.F. Skinner experiment, and it's one I absolutely love because it makes me wonder whether all these kind of conversations are maybe ultimately a waste of time. But he said, if you take a load of mice and put them on a Perspex tray and float them on the water, because they're